Part 2. The control room was eerily silent, the hum of the train now a deafening roar that seemed to echo from every corner of the room. The walls were lined with rusty, outdated equipment, but everything was completely still. There were no controls, no switches, nothing that could explain how the train was running or why it was behaving the way it was. Jack stepped forward cautiously, his flashlight sweeping over the dimly lit room. The walls were covered in grime, the floors littered with old papers, some of them yellowed with age. There was a large metal panel at the far end of the room, but it was sealed tight, as if it had been locked for decades. "This isn't right," Sarah muttered. "This doesn't look like any train control room I've ever seen." Jack nodded, his mind racing. "It doesn't look like a control room at all. It looks abandoned, like no one's been here in years." Oliver moved to the side, his flashlight illuminating a faded map on the wall. The map depicted the layout of the train, but the paths didn't match anything they had encountered. The names of the carriages were written in Cyrillic, but they were crossed out and replaced with strange symbols. Some of the compartments appeared to have no exits, and the tracks themselves didn't connect to anything in the real world. "This map, it's like the train is designed to confuse us," Oliver said, his voice strained. Max took a step back, his face pale. "I don't think we're dealing with a normal train here. This is something else, something alive." A chill ran down Jack's spine. Max was right. This train wasn't just an abandoned relic of the past. It was something far more dangerous, far more sentient than anything they had encountered. Then, as if on cue, the low growl came again. It reverberated through the walls, deep and guttural, like the sound of something waking from a long slumber. The ground beneath them began to shake. At first, it was subtle, just a slight tremor in the floor. But within seconds, it grew stronger, rattling the equipment, making the walls creak as though the entire train was about to come apart at the seams. "Get away from the panel!" Jack shouted, pulling Sarah back from the metal panel she had been examining. The rumbling was intensifying, and the air felt charged, like a storm was brewing inside the train. Suddenly, the hum stopped. The silence was so absolute it felt like the world itself had gone still. And then, in the darkness, the lights flickered. The train's control systems powered on. The map on the wall lit up. The symbols on it began to shift, moving like living creatures, rearranging themselves in real time. The compartment they were standing in darkened, and a low, distorted voice echoed through the room, like a whispering wind, carrying words too ancient to understand. "Leave." Jack's breath caught in his throat. Did anyone else hear that? Sarah looked at him wide-eyed. It came from everywhere. Before Jack could respond, a loud crash sounded from behind them, followed by the screech of metal grinding against metal. The doors to the control room slammed shut with a force that shook the floor beneath their feet. They were trapped. Max whipped around, trying to pry open the door with his bare hands, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the train itself had sealed them inside, refusing to let them leave. "Why is it trying to keep us here?" Oliver asked, his voice full of fear. "What does it want from us?" Jack clenched his fists. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not just trying to trap us, it's trying to keep us alive." The growl came again, this time closer, vibrating through the walls, the floor, the very air they breathed. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and Jack could see his breath misting in front of him. A figure appeared in the doorway. It was tall, draped in tattered clothing, its face hidden in shadow, just like the one they had seen earlier in the train. But this one wasn't moving. It was standing completely still, its eyes, or what should have been eyes, glowing faintly in the dark. Jack took a step back, a chill running down his spine. "Stay behind me." Max's hand shot out to grab Jack's arm. "That thing, it's not human." The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching them. The growl grew louder, vibrating in Jack's chest now. It was coming from the figure, or maybe from the train itself. It was impossible to tell. Then, the figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. And as it did, the train seemed to respond. The walls began to bend and warp. The lights flickered again, and the air grew thicker. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. The feeling in the room was enough. They were not alone on this train. Whatever this thing was, it was part of the train. A guardian. Or perhaps something worse. Jack's instincts screamed at him to run, but the doors were still sealed. The walls were shifting, closing in. The map on the wall continued to change, showing paths that didn't make sense, pathways that led nowhere. "We can't stay here," Jack said, his voice tight. "We have to find the source. We have to stop whatever is controlling this train." The figure took another step forward, its glowing eyes locked onto Jack, and for a moment, Jack felt a wave of cold terror wash over him. It was as if the creature knew his every thought, his every fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The room returned to silence, the hum of the train filling the air again, the vibration under their feet steady and unyielding. What the hell just happened?" Max asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Jack said, his eyes still searching the room. "But we have to keep moving. Whatever that thing is, it's just one part of this nightmare. We need to find the heart of it, the source, before it's too late." But as he spoke, the walls began to shift again. The temperature had dropped even further, the cold now biting at their skin like invisible needles. The train's hum had become a deep, resonating growl that rattled the bones of anyone still aboard. It was impossible to ignore the creeping sense of dread that had settled into the pit of Jack's stomach. The sensation that they were being watched by something far older, far more powerful than anything they could comprehend. The figure had vanished, but the feeling of its presence lingered, a shadow they couldn't escape. The walls of the train seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, and the path ahead of them continued to distort, twisting in ways that defied logic. Jack stood still for a moment, trying to steady his breath. The others were gathered behind him, eyes wide, faces pale, their fear palpable. They had been through so much already, but they knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. Whatever this train was, it wasn't going to let them go without a fight. "We need to move," Jack said, his voice firm but laced with uncertainty. "We can't stay here any longer. Whatever that thing was, it's not the end. It's just a warning." Max swallowed hard. A warning about what? Jack turned to face him, his jaw set. The source, whatever is controlling this train, whatever is making it alive, we need to find it. Sarah's voice broke the silence. "But how? Where do we even start looking?" Oliver stepped forward, pointing to the map that still hung on the wall, now flickering with unnatural light. The strange symbols continued to shift and rearrange themselves, forming paths that seemed to loop in on each other, leading to nowhere and everywhere at once. "It's like a maze," Oliver said, his fingers tracing the map. "And it keeps changing. If we follow one of these paths, we don't know where it'll take us." "That's the point," Jack said, his mind racing. "This train is alive. It's shifting because it doesn't want us to find the source. But that's exactly what we have to do. We have to find where it begins." Max looked around, his eyes frantic. "But how do we do that? Everything keeps changing. We can't even trust the map anymore." The floor trembled again, and the walls seemed to close in, making the space around them feel smaller, more claustrophobic. The low growl from earlier returned, now joined by the sound of metal grinding against metal, like the train itself was waking up, stretching, getting ready to hunt. "We find the heart," Jack said, his voice low. "The place where it all began. If we can get there, we can stop it. We have to." With that, he moved forward, his hand resting on the handle of the door to the next compartment. The others hesitated, but they followed, knowing there was no other choice. The hallway stretched before them, the walls twisting and shifting with each step they took. The shadows seemed to deepen, swallowing the light from their flashlights. It felt like they were walking into the belly of a beast, one that was aware of every movement, every breath. The growl was louder now, more insistent, as if the train was angry that they were intruding. The sound vibrated through the metal, and Jack could feel it deep in his chest, reverberating through the very bones of the train. They reached the next door, and Jack tried the handle. It was locked. He tried again, but it didn't budge. Max stepped forward, frustration written all over his face. "This isn't just a train. It's a damn prison. A trap." Jack's mind raced. They were being herded, pushed deeper into the heart of the train, where something terrible was waiting. But where? Then Oliver spoke up, his voice sharp. "The panel. It's right there." Jack turned, following Oliver's gaze. At the far end of the hallway, hidden in the shadows, was a small control panel, the same one they had seen in the control room earlier. It was covered in dust and grime, but something about it seemed different, alive even. "I'll check it out," Jack said, moving toward the panel. He approached it cautiously, his hand hovering above the controls. "No, don't touch it!" Sarah shouted, but it was too late. Jack pressed a button. The entire train shuddered, and the low growl became a full-fledged roar, a sound so loud it felt like the walls were cracking apart. The lights flickered and died, and the temperature plummeted. The floor buckled beneath them, sending them tumbling to the ground. The entire train felt as though it were being torn in two. Jack barely managed to catch himself, his hand slamming against the wall to steady himself. The others were on the floor, struggling to regain their footing. The noise was deafening, and the air was thick with the scent of rust and decay. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the chaos stopped. The train returned to its eerie stillness, the growl fading into a deep, suffocating silence. "What the hell just happened?" Max gasped, his face pale. Jack stood up, his legs shaky. "I think we just triggered something." Before anyone could respond, the floor began to vibrate again. But this time, it wasn't the train's usual hum. It was something different. The vibrations were coming from deep within the train, and they were growing stronger, faster. It was as though the train itself was preparing for something. Jack turned toward the others. "We don't have much time. It's happening. The source is waking up." The walls around them seemed to stretch and warp, distorting their surroundings until everything was an indistinct blur. A cold wind whipped through the hallway, and then, suddenly, the lights flickered back on. The train had changed. It wasn't the same as it had been before. The walls were different now, the air was heavier, and the shadows were deeper. The train had transformed, becoming something else, something more alive. And standing in the middle of it all was a figure they had seen before, but now it was more human. It was the same one they had encountered earlier, but now it was taller, its features clearer, its presence more powerful. It stepped forward, and it was no longer just a warning. The figure that stood before them was unlike anything they had ever seen. Its body was humanoid, but its features were wrong, distorted, elongated, like a silhouette made from 1,000 half-formed ideas. The dim light cast grotesque shadows across its form, emphasizing the unnatural bend of its limbs and the absence of anything resembling a human face. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, glowed faintly, a sickly yellow that flickered like dying stars. The air around it was thick, the space distorting slightly, as if reality itself was bending in response to its presence. The growl from earlier seemed to radiate from the figure, low and guttural, vibrating through the floor and into their bones. Jack could feel it in his chest, as though the creature's very essence was reverberating through the train. Sarah stepped back, her eyes wide with fear. "What the hell is that thing?" Jack's mind raced, the pieces starting to fall into place. They had triggered something by interacting with the panel, something that had set the train's guardian in motion. "I think it's protecting something," Jack said quietly, his voice shaking. "But what? And why does it look like that?" The figure didn't move. It stood there, watching them with its glowing eyes, as if waiting for them to make the next move. The train had fallen silent again, but the sense of impending danger was thick, like the calm before a storm. "We need to get out of here," Max said, his voice strained. "This place, it's wrong. We shouldn't be here." But Jack shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "No, we can't leave. Not yet. We came here to find out what happened, and we're too close to the truth now." The creature's eyes seemed to flicker, narrowing as if it had understood Jack's words. Then, in a voice that was more of a sound than anything remotely human, it spoke. "You should not have come." The words were slow, distorted, echoing in their minds. It was as if the creature wasn't speaking to them through sound, but through their thoughts, bending their reality with every word. The chill in the air grew colder, and Jack could see his breath fogging in front of him. The train's hum intensified again, but it was different now. The noise was deeper, more resonant, as if the train itself were alive, aware of their presence. "Leave now, or remain forever." It wasn't a threat, it was a warning. The creature wasn't trying to harm them, it was trying to stop them from uncovering something that shouldn't be known. But Jack wasn't about to back down. Not now. "We're not leaving," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that clung to his words. We need to know what's controlling this train. We need to know why it's alive. The creature's eyes seemed to flicker again, its long limbs twitching ever so slightly. Then, in a movement too fast for Jack to process, it reached out with one of its elongated arms, its fingers thin and sharp like the claws of a predator. Sarah screamed, and the others instinctively stepped back, but Jack stood his ground. He didn't know why, but something about the creature's presence felt familiar. Like it wasn't truly an enemy, but a gatekeeper, guarding something that had been hidden for far too long. "You are too late." The voice inside their heads grew louder, almost deafening. The walls of the train seemed to close in, the shadows stretching and distorting around them, as if the entire space was folding in on itself. The figure's gaze never left Jack, its glowing eyes fixed on him, as though it could see directly into his soul. Max, unable to contain his fear any longer, bolted for the nearest door, but it was sealed shut, just like all the others. Escape is futile. The growl reverberated through the train, shaking the floor beneath their feet. The air grew heavy, suffocating, and the temperature dropped even further. It felt like the train itself was pressing in on them, the walls breathing with the rhythm of the growl. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't understand what was happening, but one thing was clear: the train wasn't just alive. It was aware. "It's not just a train," Jack whispered, his mind struggling to piece together the fragments of information. "It's a prison. But for what?" The creature's eyes glowed brighter, its form rippling as if it was fading in and out of existence. Its body seemed to bend with the walls, merging with the very essence of the train itself. The train wasn't just an inanimate object, it was a part of something much older, much darker. And whatever was trapped inside, whatever had been contained here, was beginning to stir. The figure moved again, its movements so fluid, so unnatural that Jack's mind couldn't process it. It was no longer just guarding the train. It was becoming the train, part of its very fabric. "You should have left." The voice echoed louder now, each word vibrating with power. "The source is awakened." And then the entire train shuddered. Jack could feel the walls ripple, the floor shifting beneath his feet. The lights flickered again, but this time they didn't just flicker. They snapped out completely, plunging them into total darkness. The growl returned, but it was no longer coming from the creature. It was coming from everywhere. It was the sound of the train, alive and screaming. "We need to find the source," Jack said urgently, his voice rising above the chaos. Before it's too late. The figure was gone, but the train had changed. The air was thick, suffocating, and the hum of the train had transformed into something more, something darker. They had crossed a threshold, and there was no turning back now. The darkness swallowed them whole. The sudden loss of light sent a wave of panic through the group. Every breath seemed harder to take, the air thick with an unnatural weight. Jack's heart hammered in his chest, but he couldn't let the fear take hold now. Not when they were this close to the truth. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice a little too loud in the suffocating silence. "Stay close and stay calm." He could hear the others fumbling behind him, their voices low as they tried to regain their bearings in the pitch black. Max cursed under his breath as he bumped into a wall. "We can't even see anything." Sarah's voice wavered with fear. "We don't need to see," Jack said. "We just need to follow the train's pulse." The vibrations from the train's hum had become a living presence, pulsating in the walls, the floors, the very air. It was like the train itself was breathing, and they were caught in the rhythm of its heartbeat. The floor shifted underfoot, subtly, like the entire structure was adjusting itself to their movements, guiding them deeper into its core. A sudden, sharp sound cut through the silence, the sound of something scraping metal. Jack froze. It was a different sound, one that didn't belong. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack didn't answer at first. He strained his ears, listening for any sign of movement, any hint of what they were about to face. Another scraping noise, followed by a low, guttural growl, echoed down the hallway. The sound was coming from the train's depths, from where the walls seemed to distort into shapes that didn't make sense. It was as if the very fabric of the train was warping, pulling them further into its grip. "It's here," Jack said, his voice tight. "We're getting closer," Max groaned. "Getting closer to what, exactly?" Jack didn't answer right away. He wasn't entirely sure. The truth had been slipping through his fingers ever since they entered this place. But one thing was certain. The train wasn't just a machine. It was a sentient, living thing. And whatever had been awakened inside it, whatever had taken control of them, was growing more powerful by the second. The group moved forward, their steps slow and cautious. The walls were no longer just walls. They felt alive, vibrating beneath their fingers, pulsing with energy that seemed to be drawn from something deeper. Jack's mind was a whirlwind. What could be causing this? Why had they been brought here? Was this some kind of twisted experiment? Or had they stumbled into a forgotten corner of history where something ancient and dangerous was locked away, waiting to escape? As they moved, they passed more strange, shifting compartments, rooms that seemed to bend, to stretch, and change as they passed them. The layout was no longer linear. It was as if the train itself had begun to unfold and reshape itself, actively resisting their attempts to understand it. Then, up ahead, a faint glow appeared. It was dim at first, but it grew stronger as they got closer. The walls around them began to shift in response, the corridors twisting and turning as though the train itself was leading them to the source. Finally, they reached the end of the hallway. The glow was now bright enough to make out the shapes ahead of them. A large circular door stood before them, its surface etched with intricate symbols that looked almost alive, shifting and changing as they watched. "This is it," Jack said, his voice a mixture of awe and fear. "The heart." But as his hand reached for the door, a loud crash erupted from behind them. They spun around, startled, but there was nothing there. The growl they had been hearing was louder now, closer. Max's breath came in short, ragged gasps. "We're not alone." "No," Jack said, his voice low. "We never were." Before he could move, the door to the heart of the train began to open by itself, as if inviting them in. The symbols on its surface twisted faster, the glow becoming a brilliant, almost blinding light. The air around them hummed with power, vibrating like the very energy of the train itself was focused on this one point. Without another word, Jack led the way inside. The room was vast, far larger than any compartment they had passed through. It was filled with strange machinery. No, not machinery. It was a kind of organic mechanism, wires and metal blending together with living tissue in a way that made Jack's stomach turn. In the center of the room was a massive, pulsating core. It was an enormous mass of glowing energy, veins of light coursing through it like blood. The hum of the train was deafening now, the growl having evolved into a constant deep rumble that shook the room with every beat. "Is that the source?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I think so," Jack said, his eyes fixed on the core. The air felt charged, like they were standing at the very heart of a storm, the pressure building with every second. Then, from the center of the glowing mass, a figure began to emerge. It was not a man, nor a creature. They couldn't even tell what it was at first. It was an amalgamation of shadow and light, its form flickering and shifting as though it was never meant to be seen. Its eyes, or what could be interpreted as eyes, glowed with an intensity that burned into their minds. The growl was louder than ever, the vibrations now overwhelming. Jack's knees buckled under the pressure of the sound. "You are too late," the voice came again, louder now, an unearthly growl that shook the very foundation of the room. "You should have left." This was it, the source, the heart of the train, the being that had been awakened, that had been drawing them in all along. But now, as Jack faced it, he realized that there was no escape. Not without understanding it, not without facing whatever was lurking within the depths of this place. And with that realization, the glow of the core flared brighter than ever before. The figure at the heart of the train grew larger, its form flickering in and out of existence, like something that didn't quite belong in the fabric of reality. The glow from the core intensified, illuminating every inch of the room, casting sharp, elongated shadows on the walls. Jack could feel the temperature plummeting. His breath came in visible puffs as if the very air was being drained from the room. The growl from the core was deafening now, vibrating in his chest, making it difficult to focus. It was like standing in the presence of something ancient and powerful, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. "You should not have come here," the voice repeated, louder this time, reverberating through their bones. It was not just a sound, It was a force, a presence that seemed to invade their very thoughts. Max staggered backward, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. What the hell is it? What is this place? Jack could feel the answer, but it was just out of reach, buried deep within the chaos of his mind. He had known from the moment they had stepped onto this train that it wasn't just a haunted relic. This was something more, a prison, a vessel, an entity in itself. "We're not here to hurt you," Jack said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "We came to understand." The figure in the center of the room, if it could be called a figure, shuddered, its form rippling with an unsettling energy. The air felt electric, charged with an unknown power. "Understand?" The voice echoed. "You cannot understand what you have awakened." Sarah stepped closer to Jack, her hand trembling. "It's the source," she whispered. "The thing that's controlling the train. The heart." Jack nodded, his gaze never leaving the shifting form at the center. "We need to know why. What happened here?" For a moment, the room fell silent, the glow from the core pulsing in slow, deliberate beats. The temperature had dropped even further, the cold seeping into their skin. It felt like the very soul of the train was watching them, studying them, weighing their worth. Then, with a sudden shift, the figure spoke again. "This place is not just a train. It is a prison, a containment vessel for something ancient." The words echoed through the room, and for a moment, Jack felt a cold rush of understanding. This wasn't just a machine or a strange piece of forgotten history. This was something much darker. The figure's form began to solidify, the shadows fading to reveal more details. It wasn't a being that could be easily described. It seemed to be made of the same energy that powered the train, an amalgamation of light and darkness, alive in a way that was beyond human comprehension. "The prison was built long ago," the voice continued, "to hold something that should never be released, and you have triggered its awakening." A surge of dread washed over Jack as the figure's words sank in. The train had been built to contain something, something dangerous. And now, whatever it was stirring. "We didn't mean to," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't know." The figure's glowing eyes narrowed. "It does not matter. You have already set it free." Suddenly, the room shook, the floor beneath them trembling as if the train itself was waking up. The glow from the core flared, blinding them for a split second. Jack's heart raced. They had no idea what they had unleashed, but it was clear now. Whatever was locked inside the train was far worse than they could have imagined. The air thickened, and the train's hum grew louder, more intense. The walls began to shift again, bending and warping as if they were alive, as if they were closing in on the group. "We need to stop it," Jack said urgently, his voice rising in desperation. "We need to shut it down before it's too late." But the figure simply watched them, its glowing eyes burning with an intensity that made Jack's skin crawl. "There is no stopping it." As the words echoed in their minds, Jack felt a sense of inevitability wash over him. The train wasn't just alive. It was a part of whatever had been awakened, a vessel carrying something ancient and malevolent. Max shook his head, panic creeping into his voice. "What do we do? We can't just stand here!" Jack swallowed, his mind racing. The source, the heart of the train, was a sentient being. It wasn't just a machine, it was a living entity, bound to something far more powerful. He looked around, his eyes scanning the room. The walls, the core, the strange machinery. It was all connected. He could feel it now. Like the train itself was a part of the creature that had been contained here. It was a prison, yes, but it was also a feeding ground, a way for the entity to grow and gain power. "We have to destroy it," Jack said, his voice resolute. "We have to stop whatever's inside from escaping." But as he said the words, the air around them grew colder, the growl from the core intensifying, becoming a low, resonant hum that vibrated through their entire bodies. "You cannot destroy what you do not understand," the figure hissed, its voice becoming a twisted, distorted growl. "You are too weak, too fragile." The train shook again, the walls groaning in protest, as if the entire structure was fighting to keep the entity contained. "We have no choice," Jack said, clenching his fists. "We stop it now, or we all die." The figure's form flickered, its presence warping in and out of existence. The room was vibrating with a terrifying force, and the floor beneath their feet began to crack. "We're running out of time," Jack said, his eyes darting to the glowing core. He could feel the train pulsing faster now, like a heartbeat accelerating out of control. And then, just as everything seemed to be spiraling toward disaster, he realized something. The core wasn't just a source of power. It was the key. If they could disrupt the core, they could disrupt the train itself. They just had to find a way to disconnect it, to sever the bond between the entity. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be safe. But it was their only chance. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread. The train groaned again, louder this time, as if it were a living thing protesting its inevitable fate. The core, still pulsating with an eerie glow, seemed to hum faster, its beat matching the rapid thumping of Jack's heart. "We need to destroy it," Jack said, his voice steady despite the fear that clawed at his insides. "We have to find a way to break its connection to the train." Max glanced around frantically, his eyes darting over the strange machinery, the walls that warped and twisted like a living organism. "How? We don't even know what we're dealing with here." Sarah, her hand trembling at her side, stepped closer to the core, her eyes fixed on the strange organic patterns that pulsed in time with the train's heartbeat. "We need to get to the heart of it. Whatever this thing is, it's connected to the core. If we destroy that, we can sever the link." Jack nodded, but his mind was racing. The figure had said they were too weak, too fragile to understand what was happening. But Jack knew that wasn't true. They had come this far. They had already survived the horrors of the train. The truth was within reach. They just had to push forward. The figure, which had remained silent since their last exchange, seemed to shimmer, its form flickering in and out of focus. Its glowing eyes were locked on Jack, burning with an intensity that sent a chill through him. "You cannot stop what has already been set in motion," the figure growled, its voice like a low, guttural hiss that vibrated through the walls. "The awakening has begun. There is no going back." Jack clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. "I don't care what you think. We'll stop it." The figure's form shifted, a dark ripple spreading through it. For a moment, the room seemed to darken, the light from the core flickering and distorting. The figure raised one long, thin arm, pointing toward them. "You cannot defy fate." Before Jack could respond, the entire room began to tremble, the floor shaking violently beneath their feet. The walls seemed to collapse inward, as if the very structure of the train was folding in on itself, responding to the figure's power. Max stumbled backward, grabbing onto the nearest support beam. "It's going to crush us! We need to get out of here!" But Jack couldn't move. His gaze was fixed on the glowing core, the center of everything. He could feel its power intensifying, the vibrations growing stronger with each passing second. This was the moment, the breaking point. The train wasn't just alive. It was feeding. Jack turned to Sarah, who was still staring at the core, her face pale with realization. "Sarah, you're right. The core is the key. If we can destroy it, we destroy the connection to whatever's been awakened here." But Sarah asked, her voice strained with panic, "How do we even begin?" Jack took a deep breath. He didn't know, but he knew they had to act fast. Without warning, he sprinted toward the core, his mind racing. The figure's presence loomed behind him, but he didn't dare look back. Every instinct screamed at him to get away, but there was no escape. The only way out was to destroy what they had awoken. The glow from the core was blinding now, the pulsations faster, erratic, like a heartbeat that was about to explode. The noise was deafening, like 1,000 growls, all coming from different directions, crashing together in a cacophony of power. Max and Sarah followed behind him, their footsteps faltering as the walls shook violently. The growl of the train had morphed into something else, a deep, guttural roar that reverberated through the very bones of the structure. It was as if the train was screaming in pain, and they were the cause. Jack reached the center of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. The core was before him, glowing with a fierce intensity that almost made him want to step back. But there was no time. He had to act. "You cannot destroy me," the figure hissed. "I am eternal." Jack ignored the voice, his eyes narrowing as he searched for something, anything, that would give him a chance. There had to be a way. The core was the key, the source of the train's life. If they could sever its connection, they could stop whatever had been awakened here. His eyes caught a faint shimmer in the center of the core, a weak spot, an opening where the energy was flowing more erratically. Without thinking, he reached out, grabbing a nearby piece of jagged metal that had broken off from the walls. He drove it toward the weak spot, his breath quickening. The moment the metal made contact, a shockwave rippled through the room. The core flared, its light blinding, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. Then the growl returned, louder than before, thunderous like an animal in pain. The walls of the room began to crack, the energy around them becoming wild, chaotic. Jack could feel the air around him distorting, the very fabric of reality seeming to bend in response to the energy being released. "We need to get out now!" Max screamed, his voice barely audible over the roar of the train. But Jack couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, staring at the core as it pulsed and writhed in agony. The figure's form flickered behind him, its presence growing more intense. "You do not understand," the figure howled. "Sure, you cannot stop what you have set in motion. You have awakened the beast." The walls began to shudder violently, the very foundation of the train shaking. Jack's heart raced, adrenaline coursing through his veins. This was it, the breaking point. The train was alive, and it was reacting to the threat they had just triggered. The beast inside was stirring, and they had to escape before it consumed everything. With a final desperate push, Jack tore the jagged metal free, and the core exploded in a burst of blinding light. End of part 2.